The morning sun peeked through the tall windows of Oakwood Music Academy as Li Wei pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway. At 35, her petite frame moved with quiet purpose, her eyes always downcast as if trying not to be noticed. This was her second week as the new janitor, a job she had taken after moving to this small city hoping to start fresh. Li Wei enjoyed arriving before anyone else. The quiet halls gave her time to be alone with her thoughts and the beautiful instruments that filled each room. She took special care when dusting the pianos, her fingers occasionally hovering above the keys without touching them. Focus on your work, she reminded herself softly. That's all that matters now. Her morning routine was straightforward. Empty the trash bins, wipe down surfaces, vacuum carpets, and mop the tile floors. Li Wei was thorough, paying extra attention to the music stands and piano keys, making sure they shined. The teachers never seemed to notice her efforts, but the students sometimes gave her grateful smiles when they found their practice rooms spotless. By 8 o'clock, teachers began arriving with coffee cups and stacks of sheet music. They hurried past Li Wei as if she were invisible, discussing upcoming recitals and problem students. She made herself smaller when they walked by, offering a polite nod that rarely received acknowledgement. "I need that recital hall perfectly clean for the board meeting this afternoon," called out Mr. Thompson, the school director, without actually looking at Li Wei. His tie was slightly crooked, and his glasses slipped down his nose as he hurried past. "Yes, sir," Li Wei replied, though he was already too far away to hear her soft voice. As morning turned to afternoon, students filled the building. Young people with instrument cases on their backs, laughing and talking about weekend plans or stressing over upcoming performances. Li Wei watched them with quiet interest. Some looked tired with dark circles under their eyes from late-night practicing. Others walked with confidence, backs straight and heads high, already carrying themselves like professional musicians. During her lunch break, Li Wei sat alone on a bench in the courtyard. She unwrapped her simple sandwich and watched birds hop around nearby trees. From inside the building, she could hear fragments of music, a violin playing Bach, a flute working through a difficult passage, a cello's deep tones. Her foot tapped gently to the rhythms without her realizing it. The afternoon brought a new energy to the academy. Practice rooms filled with music, some beautiful, some painfully struggling through difficult sections. Li Wei found herself lingering outside certain doors, listening with closed eyes when particularly moving melodies reached her. Outside room 7, a young woman was playing Chopin's Nocturne in B-flat minor. Her technique was excellent, but something was missing in the emotional delivery. "Are you planning to clean this century?" Li Wei jumped at the sharp voice behind her. Mrs. Zhao, the theory teacher known for her strict demeanor, stood with arms crossed, her eyebrows raised in judgment. "I'm sorry. I was just," Li Wei stammered. "Wasting time," Mrs. Zhao finished for her. "The practice rooms in the East Wing are a mess, and there's sheet music scattered everywhere." "I'll take care of it right away," Li Wei said, quickly pushing her cart away. As she cleaned the East Wing, she could feel Mrs. Zhao watching her every move. The students glanced at Li Wei with either indifference or awkward sympathy. "While our janitor finally does her job," Mrs. Zhao announced to a passing colleague, "would you like to hear about Chen's disaster of a performance yesterday?" Her voice carried a dismissive tone that made Li Wei's cheeks burn with embarrassment. Later that afternoon, Li Wei found herself alone in the main performance hall. The space was empty except for the magnificent grand piano on the stage. The room would be used tomorrow for a faculty concert, and everything needed to be perfect. After finishing the floors and seats, Li Wei stood at the back looking at the piano that seemed to call to her across the room. After checking that the hallway was empty, she quietly walked onto the stage. The polished surface of the piano reflected the soft lights. Li Wei's heart pounded as she gently lifted the cover and revealed the keys. For a long moment, she just stared at them, not daring to touch. 8 years had passed since she last played a piano of this quality. 8 years since she had walked away from that life. Li Wei looked at her hands, roughened now from cleaning products and hard work, nails cut short and practical. Once these same hands had moved across keys on stages in Beijing, Paris, and New York. With a deep breath, Li Wei sat on the bench, her posture automatically adjusting to the perfect form taught to her since childhood. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys without pressing down, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. The sensation sent a familiar shiver through her body. "What do you think you're doing?" Li Wei jumped up so quickly she nearly knocked over the bench. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Chen, the head of piano studies. His stern expression made Li Wei's stomach drop. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just finishing cleaning," she said, quickly moving away from the piano. "Were you touching the Steinway?" he asked, walking toward the stage with slow, deliberate steps. "No, sir. I mean, just to clean it. I was making sure it was ready for tomorrow." The lie felt heavy in her mouth. Dr. Chen ran his hand over the piano's surface, checking for dust. Finding none, his expression softened slightly. "This instrument is worth more than you could imagine," he said, his tone still firm but less accusatory. "Only faculty and advanced students are allowed to touch it." "I understand. It won't happen again," Li Wei promised, gathering her cleaning supplies with shaking hands. "See that it doesn't," he replied before turning to leave. At the door he paused. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Yes, sir. Started 2 weeks ago." He nodded without further comment and left. That evening, Li Wei was the last to leave the building. As she locked up, fragments of music still echoed in her mind. Pieces she had once known by heart, played on stages around the world. Her small apartment was only a 15-minute walk away. The one-bedroom space was simple but clean. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph facing away from the door. Li Wei never allowed visitors to see what the picture contained. After a simple dinner of noodles and vegetables, she went to her bedroom closet and pulled out a small keyboard with headphones. Nothing like the grand piano at the academy, but it was all she allowed herself now. Li Wei plugged in the headphones and turned the power on. The plastic keys felt nothing like a real piano, but her fingers remembered. She began to play quietly, a Debussy piece that had once been part of her regular program. Her hands moved with a grace that revealed years of intensive training, muscle memory that couldn't be erased by time or circumstance. As she played, tears formed in her eyes. The music brought back memories, the spotlights, the applause, the pressure, the endless practice hours, and finally, the personal tragedy that made her walk away. The moment when Li Wei, once known to the music world as Li Wei Yan, the piano prodigy from Shanghai, decided to disappear. The clock showed 1:43 a.m. when she finally stopped playing and put the keyboard away. Tomorrow would bring another day of invisible work at the academy, another day of pretending she was nothing more than a woman who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans, another day of hiding from who she once had been. In the apartment next door, a baby started crying. Li Wei could hear the mother's soft voice singing a lullaby. The simple melody carried through the thin walls, reminding Li Wei of songs her own mother used to sing. Music had always been part of her life, even before formal training. Now she lived in its shadows, close enough to hear it but not allowing herself to fully embrace it again. As she drifted off to sleep, Li Wei wondered how long she could keep working in a place so filled with music before someone recognized her. Or worse, before she could no longer resist the pull of the piano and the life she had left behind. The teaching job offer from a small community music school sat unopened on her kitchen table. Taking it would mean stepping back into the world of music, even if just at its edges. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that yet. Tomorrow, the academy would host a renowned pianist for a master class. Li Wei had seen the posters in the hallway. Professor Huang, her former teacher. She would need to be extra careful to avoid being seen. Some secrets were worth protecting, even if they meant living in the shadows of what might have been. Li Wei arrived at Oakwood Music Academy earlier than usual the next morning. Professor Huang's master class was scheduled for the afternoon, and she wanted to make sure all the classrooms were spotless before slipping away to work in more distant parts of the building. The memory of her former teacher's stern face still made her hands tremble slightly. Professor Huang had been the one who discovered Li Wei playing piano at a community center when she was just 6 years old. "This child has a gift," he had told her parents. It would be a crime to waste it. And so began 15 years of rigorous training, international competitions, and eventually, world tours. As Li Wei polished the brass doorknobs in the West Wing, she heard excited chatter from the students gathering in the hallway. "I heard Professor Huang once made a student cry during a master class in Vienna," said a boy with a violin case. "That's nothing," replied a girl clutching sheet music. "My cousin attended his class in Singapore and said he made 3 people leave the stage in tears. But those who survive his criticism become amazing. Li Wei kept her head down as she moved past them. Professor Huang's methods had always been harsh but effective. She still remembered how he would rap her knuckles with a thin wooden ruler when her hand position slipped during difficult passages. Perfection requires sacrifice, he would say. If you cannot handle criticism, you cannot handle greatness. By mid-morning, Director Thompson cornered Li Wei as she emptied trash bins in the faculty lounge. "You," he said, pointing at her as if he couldn't remember her name. "We need someone to help in the recital hall during the master class. The regular stage manager called in sick." Li Wei's stomach dropped. "But sir, I still have the East Wing to clean and—" "The East Wing can wait," he interrupted. "This is Professor Huang we're talking about. One of the most influential pianists in the world is visiting our academy, and I need everything to be perfect." He handed her a list. "These are his requirements. Make sure everything is ready by noon." Li Wei stared at the paper in her hand after Director Thompson hurried away. The list was detailed and demanding. Specific lighting requirements, exact temperature settings, a particular brand of bottled water, and precise positioning of the piano on stage. But what made her blood run cold was the last item. Assistant needed backstage during entire masterclass. There was no way to avoid it now. She would have to be in the same room as Professor Huang, the man who would certainly recognize her if he got a good look at her face. For the next 2 hours, Li Wei worked frantically to prepare the recital hall. She adjusted the piano's position using the wheeled platform beneath it, set up water bottles and towels, and made sure the temperature was exactly 72 degrees. All the while, she planned how to keep her face turned away, how to stay in the shadows. At noon, students began filing into the hall, their faces a mixture of excitement and terror. 6 had been selected to perform for Professor Huang, and their nervous energy filled the room. Li Wei busied herself adjusting the curtains at the back of the stage, keeping her back to the audience. "You there, stagehand?" The voice made Li Wei freeze. It was Mrs. Zhao. "Come fix this piano bench. It's wobbly." Keeping her head down, Li Wei hurried to the piano. She knelt beside the bench, focusing on the uneven leg, using her hair as a curtain to hide her face. "That will do," Mrs. Zhao said, not bothering to thank her. "Now stay backstage until needed." Li Wei retreated to the shadows behind the curtain just as the main doors opened. A hush fell over the crowd as Professor Huang entered. Even without seeing him, Li Wei could picture his straight posture, his measured steps, the slight tilt of his head that indicated he was already evaluating everything around him. Director Thompson's voice boomed through the hall as he introduced their distinguished guest. Li Wei peeked through a small gap in the curtains. Professor Huang looked older than she remembered, his hair now completely gray, but his eyes still held that intense focus that had both inspired and terrified his students. "I do not believe in wasting time with excessive pleasantries," Professor Huang said after a brief acknowledgement of the introduction. "Music speaks for itself. Who will be first?" A young man approached the piano, his sheet music clutched tightly in trembling hands. "I'll be playing Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor," he said, his voice barely audible. Professor Huang nodded curtly. "Proceed." The student began playing, his technique solid but rigid. Li Wei could hear the notes being played correctly, but there was a mechanical quality to the performance, a lack of soul that would never escape Professor Huang's notice. Sure enough, after just 2 minutes, Professor Huang raised his hand. "Stop." The student froze, his hands hovering above the keys. "You are playing notes, not music," Professor Huang said. "Where is the emotion? Where is the story?" Chopin was not writing an instruction manual. He was pouring his heart onto the page. The young man nodded, looking close to tears. "Again, from the beginning. This time imagine you are telling me about the greatest loss you have ever experienced." The student began again, this time with slightly more feeling, but still far from what the piece demanded. Li Wei's fingers twitched at her sides, muscle memory taking over as they played invisible keys in the air, showing how the emotional passages should flow. The master class continued this way through 3 more students. Each played well by most standards but fell short of Professor Huang's exacting expectations. Li Wei was called to adjust the lights twice and to bring fresh water once, each time keeping her face turned away, her movements quick and efficient. The 5th student, a young woman, approached the piano with more confidence than the others. "I'll be playing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor," she announced. Professor Huang raised an eyebrow. An ambitious choice. Let us see if it is also a wise one. The student began playing with technical proficiency and some emotional understanding of the piece. She made it further than the others before Professor Huang stopped her. Your left hand is dragging in the middle section, he said. The rhythm must be precise even as the emotion builds. Watch. He gestured for the student to move and took her place at the piano. Li Wei instinctively stepped deeper into the shadows as Professor Huang sat down. His hands, still powerful despite his age, hovered above the keys for a moment before descending. The notes that filled the hall were perfect, technically flawless and emotionally rich. Li Wei closed her eyes, transported back to the countless lessons where she had watched those same hands demonstrate how a piece should be played. When he finished the section, Professor Huang turned to the student. Do you hear the difference? She nodded, eyes wide with admiration. Good, now who is our final performer today? Director Thompson hurried onto the stage looking flustered. I'm afraid our last student is taken ill, Professor. Food poisoning, it seems. Professor Huang's disappointment was evident. A pity. I was told this final student showed particular promise with Beethoven's Appassionata. An uncomfortable silence fell over the hall. Professor Huang checked his watch. We have 30 minutes remaining in our scheduled time. It seems a waste. Perhaps one of our faculty could play, suggested Mrs. Zhao, looking eager for a chance to impress the renowned pianist. Professor Huang waved a dismissive hand. I did not come here to listen to teachers. I came to teach students. His gaze swept around the room, landing briefly on the shadowy area where Li Wei stood. Is there no one else prepared to play today? Director Thompson looked increasingly uncomfortable. Well, there is the matter of the reception afterward. We could start early. Nonsense, Professor Huang interrupted. Music first, then socializing. He stood up from the piano bench and walked toward the curtain, directly toward where Li Wei was hiding. She shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. You, he said, noticing her. Stagehand. Li Wei kept her face down, heart pounding. Yes, sir? You've been listening to these performances all afternoon. Do you play? A murmur of amusement rippled through the audience. The idea of a janitor playing for Professor Huang seemed absurd to them. Li Wei began, not knowing how to answer. Director Thompson hurried over. Professor, this is just our maintenance staff. Perhaps we should... I asked a simple question, Professor Huang said sharply. Do you play the piano? He was looking directly at Li Wei now, trying to see her downturned face. A little, she whispered, knowing any other answer would sound suspicious. Professor Huang was silent for a moment. Then, to everyone's shock, he gestured toward the piano. Then play something. Anything you know. The audience's murmurs grew louder. Some students were openly laughing now. Director Thompson looked mortified. Professor, surely you're joking, Mrs. Zhao said with an uncomfortable laugh. She cleans toilets. And perhaps she also plays piano, Professor Huang replied coolly. I have found music in unexpected places throughout my career. He turned back to Li Wei. Well, will you play for us? Li Wei stood frozen, caught between her desire to remain hidden and the pull of the piano that had never truly left her. 8 years of hiding, of playing only in the darkness of her apartment with headphones, of denying the core of who she was. If you don't wish to, just say so, Professor Huang said, his voice gentler than before. Li Wei raised her head slightly, not enough to be recognized, but enough to see the piano waiting on stage. It was as if it were calling to her, offering a moment of truth after years of lies. I'll play, she said quietly. The recital hall fell silent as Li Wei slowly walked toward the piano. She could feel every eye on her. The students' curious stares, Mrs. Zhao's disapproving glare, Director Thompson's embarrassed grimace. Her work uniform suddenly felt too tight, too obvious. A costume that no longer fit the role she was about to play. As Li Wei sat on the bench, she kept her face angled down, her long hair falling forward like a protective curtain. Her hands, rough from cleaning chemicals, hovered above the keys. What should she play? Something simple would maintain her cover but feel like a lie. Something complex would reveal too much. Whenever you're ready, Professor Huang said, his voice neither kind nor unkind, simply waiting. Li Wei took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The cool ivory felt like coming home after a long journey. She began with a simple Bach prelude, one of the first pieces she had mastered as a child. The notes were clear and precise, but she deliberately held back, playing it like someone with basic training might. Professor Huang watched with narrowed eyes. After she finished the short piece, a few audience members applauded politely, their expressions a mixture of surprise and condescension, the kind of reaction one gives a child who has performed better than expected. That was, Director Thompson began, clearly relieved that the awkward moment had passed without disaster. Restrained, Professor Huang interrupted. He hadn't moved from his spot near the curtain, his arms crossed as he studied Li Wei. "You're holding back." Li Wei kept her eyes on the keys. "It's a simple piece, sir. Indeed. Perhaps something more challenging would be appropriate." Professor Huang walked to the piano and placed a sheet of music in front of her. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The first movement. Li Wei's heart nearly stopped. It had been her signature piece, the one she had performed in Carnegie Hall 8 years ago. The last piece she had played publicly before walking away from everything. "This might be too difficult," she said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady. A ripple of laughter spread through the audience. Of course it was too difficult, she was just a janitor. "Try," Professor Huang said simply. There was something in his voice, a hint of challenge that seemed oddly personal. Li Wei stared at the familiar notes, her mind racing. Playing this piece as it deserved to be played would expose her completely. Playing it poorly would be a desecration of the music she had once lived for. She glanced up just for a moment and met Professor Huang's eyes. A flicker of recognition passed over his face, not full realization but a shadow of familiarity, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. Li Wei looked back at the keys. She could walk away. She could laugh it off, claim the piece was far beyond her abilities, and return to her invisible life of mops and cleaning solutions. It would be safer. Simpler. But the piano was waiting. She began to play. The opening chords filled the hall, powerful and resonant. Li Wei tried at first to contain her skill, to play just well enough to be impressive for a janitor, but not remarkable in a broader sense. But the music had its own demands, its own soul. As the piece progressed, her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, her posture straightening, her touch becoming more nuanced. The emotional core of the piece, its longing, its passion, its beauty, began to emerge. She couldn't help it. The music was flowing through her now, unstoppable as a river breaking through a dam. In the audience, the murmurs of amusement had stopped. The students leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide. Mrs. Zhao's mouth hung open in disbelief. Director Thompson stood frozen at the side of the stage, coffee cup halfway to his lips. And Professor Huang watched with an expression that slowly transformed from curiosity to stunned recognition. Li Wei was no longer in the recital hall. She was everywhere she had ever performed this piece: Tokyo, Berlin, New York. She was nowhere but inside the music itself. Her fingers flew across the keys with a precision and emotional depth that can only come from thousands of hours of practice combined with raw, natural talent. The complicated runs, the delicate passages, the thundering chords, all executed with a mastery that could not be hidden or denied. When she reached the end of the movement, Li Wei remained still, hands resting on the final chord, eyes closed. For a moment there was complete silence. Then the hall erupted. Students jumped to their feet, applauding wildly. Some were shouting questions. Others simply stared in amazement. Director Thompson had dropped his coffee cup, the brown liquid spreading unnoticed across the polished floor. "It's her!" Professor Huang's voice cut through the chaos. He stepped forward, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. "Li Wei Yan." The name hung in the air like a spell, silencing the room once more. Li Wei finally looked up, pushing her hair back from her face, no longer hiding. "Hello, Professor," she said quietly. 8 years, he said, his voice uncharacteristically emotional. 8 years since you disappeared. The music world thought you were dead. Director Thompson stepped forward, confusion written across his face. "What is happening?" "Who is Li Wei Yan?" Professor Huang turned to him, his expression stern. "You have been employing one of the most brilliant pianists of her generation to mop your floors." He gestured toward Li Wei. "This woman was my most accomplished student. She won the International Chopin competition at 19. She performed with the Berlin Philharmonic at 22. And then, After a sold-out performance at Carnegie Hall, she vanished without a trace. All eyes turned to Li Wei, who sat very still at the piano, her hands now folded in her lap. "Is this true?" Director Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Li Wei nodded slowly. "Yes, but why?" A young female student near the front blurted out, "Why would you give all that up to become a janitor?" The question hung in the air, both rude and inevitable. Li Wei looked down at her hands that had once been pampered, protected, insured for millions. Hands that now scrubbed toilets and wiped windows. "Because I needed to," she said simply. Professor Huang stepped closer to the piano. "Your parents' accident," he said softly. "That was why you left." Li Wei nodded again, a familiar pain tightening her chest. "They died on their way to my Carnegie Hall performance. A taxi accident 6 blocks from the venue. I was playing Rachmaninoff while they were dying." She took a shaky breath. "I didn't find out until after the standing ovation. My manager thought it would affect my performance." A collective gasp went through the audience. "I couldn't play after that," Li Wei continued. "Every note felt wrong, empty, so I walked away. Changed my name slightly. Took jobs where no one would look for a concert pianist. Lived quietly. Until today," Professor Huang said. Li Wei looked around the hall at all the shocked faces staring back at her. Her carefully constructed anonymity was shattered. The thought was both terrifying and somehow relieving, like taking off a heavy backpack after a long hike. "Until today," she agreed. Director Thompson seemed to recover his composure, a calculated look replacing his shock. "This is extraordinary. We must arrange a proper recital immediately. The publicity alone—" "No," Li Wei interrupted firmly. "I'm not ready for that." "But surely after what we just heard," he began. "What you heard was a moment, not a comeback," Li Wei said, standing up from the piano bench. "I haven't performed in 8 years for a reason." Professor Huang studied her face. "Yet you still play. I can see it in your hands, hear it in your performance. The muscle memory is too perfect for someone who has abandoned the piano completely." Li Wei thought of her small keyboard, the headphones, the late nights playing in her darkened apartment. "I play for myself. Only for myself." "That is a waste," Professor Huang said, but his tone held no judgment, only sadness. "Is it?" Li Wei challenged. "I was playing concert halls before I knew what I wanted from life. Music was chosen for me. My schedule, my repertoire, my entire existence was decided by others." She gestured to her janitor's uniform. "For the first time, I am choosing my own path." "By cleaning up after spoiled students?" Mrs. Zhao asked incredulously. "By living simply," Li Wei corrected. "By finding out who I am without applause." The hall was quiet as everyone absorbed her words. Li Wei suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that even performing had never made her feel. She had revealed not just her identity but her pain, her choices, her truth. Professor Huang broke the silence. "The music still speaks through you, Li Wei, whether you wish it to or not." A female teacher Li Wei hadn't noticed before stepped forward. "Perhaps there is a middle path," she suggested. Her voice was kind, her eyes understanding. "Not the concert halls and world tours, but not hiding either." "What do you mean?" Li Wei asked. "We need a piano teacher for our beginner students," the woman said. "Someone who understands both the technical aspects and the emotional journey of learning music." She smiled gently. "Someone who knows the value of playing for oneself." Li Wei felt something stir within her. Not the old ambition or the familiar fear, but something new. Something like possibility. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Think about it," Professor Huang said. "The greatest pianists are not always those who play the most concert halls. Sometimes they are those who pass the true spirit of music to the next generation." Li Wei looked back at the piano, its black and white keys both familiar and strange, both her past and perhaps her future. "I will think about it," she promised. The next morning, Li Wei stood outside Oakwood Music Academy, with a mop in one hand and her resignation letter in the other. After yesterday's revelation, she had spent a sleepless night weighing her options. Part of her wanted to run again, to find another anonymous job in another town where no one knew her name or her past. But another part, a part she had silenced for 8 years, whispered that perhaps it was time to stop running. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The hallway, usually quiet at this early hour, was buzzing with activity. Students huddled in small groups, their excited whispers stopping abruptly when they noticed her. Their eyes followed her as she walked past, no longer invisible. "There she is," someone said loudly. "The janitor who plays like a concert pianist." Li Wei kept her eyes forward, her back straight, the posture of someone walking onto a stage rather than someone pushing a cleaning cart. She had made her decision during the dark hours of the night. No more hiding, but no returning to her old life either. Something new. Something on her own terms. Director Thompson was waiting outside his office. Ms. Wei, or should I say Ms. Yan, I was hoping to speak with you." His tone was completely different from yesterday, warm and respectful where it had once been dismissive or simply absent. "Li Wei is fine," she said quietly, handing him the envelope. "My resignation." His face fell as he took the letter. "Please at least come into my office before making any final decisions." Li Wei followed him inside, surprised to find Professor Huang and the female teacher from yesterday, Ms. Tao. She now remembered, already seated and waiting. "We've been discussing your situation," Director Thompson said, motioning for Li Wei to sit down. "My situation?" Li Wei repeated, remaining standing. "Your extraordinary talent," Professor Huang clarified, "and the opportunity it presents for all involved." Li Wei felt a familiar tension rising in her chest. "I'm not interested in being an opportunity." Ms. Tao leaned forward, her kind eyes meeting Li Wei's. "What are you interested in, Li Wei?" The simple question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in a very long time. What did she want? Not fame, not applause, not the grueling tour schedules and constant pressure of her former life. "Peace," she said finally, "and music on my own terms." Ms. Tao nodded as if this made perfect sense. "The teaching position I mentioned yesterday, it's part-time, 3 days a week. Beginning students only. No recitals unless you choose to organize them. No pressure to perform yourself. We would, of course, adjust the salary to reflect your qualifications," Director Thompson added quickly. "A significant increase from your current position." Li Wei looked at her calloused hands. "I haven't taught before." "You were taught by the best," Professor Huang said. "You know what works and what doesn't." His expression softened slightly. "And you know what it costs to pursue perfection at all costs. That perspective alone is valuable." Li Wei thought about the young students she had watched in the hallways, some driven and stressed, others simply enjoying the journey of learning music. She thought about what she might have become if someone had shown her a different path, one where music remained joy rather than obligation. "I will consider the teaching position," she said finally. "But I have conditions." Director Thompson looked relieved. "Of course, anything. No publicity. No announcements about my background. I teach as Li Wei, not as Li Wei Yan, the former prodigy. But the marketing potential," Director Thompson began, "is not my concern," Li Wei finished firmly. "I'm not interested in being a celebrity teacher. I want to work with students who love music, not parents who want bragging rights about their child studying with a former concert pianist." Professor Huang's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You always were stubborn." "I learned from the best," Li Wei replied, meeting his gaze directly. Ms. Tao made a note on her tablet. "What else?" "I keep my apartment, my simple life. I teach because I want to, not because I need to." "Agreed," Director Thompson said quickly. "And one more thing," Li Wei added, her voice softening. "I want to start a scholarship program for local children who can't afford lessons. Children who play because they love it, not because their parents push them." The room fell silent. Director Thompson looked like he was calculating costs in his head. Professor Huang's expression was unreadable. Ms. Tao simply waited. "We can allocate funds from the upcoming benefit concert," Director Thompson said finally. "Speaking of which, would you consider—" "No," Li Wei interrupted. "I'm not ready to perform publicly. Not even to help fund your own scholarship program?" He pressed. Li Wei hesitated. The thought of walking onto a stage again, facing an audience filled with expectations, made her heart race uncomfortably. But the thought of children learning music because of her, children who might otherwise never touch a piano, that was different. "I'll think about it," she said, surprising herself. 2 weeks later, Li Wei stood in the smallest practice room at Oakwood, watching as a 7-year-old boy named Jun pressed piano keys with determined concentration. His tongue stuck out slightly from the corner of his mouth as he worked through a simple piece. "Very good," Li Wei said when he finished. Do you know why that sounded better than last time? Jun shook his head, his feet swinging above the floor from the piano bench. You were playing the notes before, Li Wei explained. This time you were playing the music. Do you feel the difference? It's like... Jun's face scrunched up as he searched for words. Like the first time I was just pushing buttons, but this time I was telling a story? Li Wei smiled. Exactly. Teaching, Li Wei had discovered, was nothing like she had imagined. It was exhausting and rewarding in equal measure. Some students were naturally gifted, others struggled with the basics. But all of them showed her something new about music, about learning, about the infinite ways to approach a single piece. After Jun left, Li Wei had a 30-minute break before her next student. She sat at the piano playing softly, experimenting with a passage from Debussy that had been running through her mind all morning. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice Professor Huang standing in the doorway until he spoke. You're composing again, he said. Li Wei's hand stilled on the keys. Just playing around with ideas. Professor Huang entered the room and sat on a spare chair. You always did that even as a child, taking existing pieces and making them your own. Your parents thought it was disrespectful to the composers. I always thought it showed promise. The mention of her parents brought a familiar ache, but it was duller now, softened by time and by her new purpose. The benefit concert is in 3 weeks, Professor Huang said, changing the subject. Director Thompson is still hoping you'll reconsider performing. Li Wei shook her head. I'm not ready. Will you ever be ready, or is that just what you tell yourself? Professor Huang's question was blunt, characteristic of his teaching style. I don't know, Li Wei admitted. The thought of an audience, all those eyes, all those expectations. Then don't play for them, Professor Huang suggested. Play for yourself as you do in your apartment at night. Play for your students to show them what music can be. The audience is just incidental. Li Wei considered his words. I'll think about it. Professor Huang nodded and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. Your teaching is making a difference. The beginners are talking about the new teacher who makes music feel like magic. They don't know about Li Wei Yan. They just know their teacher helps them find joy in playing. After he left, Li Wei remained at the piano, thinking about joy and magic and music. She played the passage again, then reached for a pencil and began notating the changes she had improvised. For the first time in 8 years, she was writing her own music. The night of the benefit concert arrived with a surprising lack of fanfare, at least for Li Wei. True to his word, Director Thompson had not publicized her background, listing her simply as Li Wei, piano instructor on the program. She was scheduled to play one piece, her own composition, a gentle, thoughtful piece she had titled After Silence. Backstage, Li Wei paced in her simple black dress, nothing like the elaborate gowns of her concert days. Her hands were steady, but her mind raced with doubts. What if she froze? What if the music that flowed so freely in private abandoned her in public? A small knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Jun and 2 other young students, their eyes wide with excitement. We came to wish you good luck, Teacher Li, Jun said, holding out a slightly crumpled handmade card. Li Wei took it, touched by the childish drawings of pianos and music notes. Thank you. Are you scared? Asked one of the other children, a little girl with braided hair. Li Wei considered lying but decided against it. A little. My mom says when you're scared of something, you should remember why you're doing it, the girl said solemnly. Li Wei smiled. Your mom is very wise. After the children left, Li Wei sat quietly, thinking about why she was doing this. Not for fame or acclaim, not even for the scholarship program, though that was part of it. She was playing because music had always been her truest voice, even when she had tried to silence it. When her name was called, Li Wei walked onto the stage without the dramatic entrance of her past performances. The lights were softer, the audience smaller than the concert halls she had once known. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and took a moment to center herself. Then she began to play. The piece started softly, hesitantly, like someone testing their voice after years of silence. Gradually, it built in complexity and confidence, weaving in hints of classical pieces that had shaped her life but transformed into something entirely new. It was the story of her journey, the early brilliance, the crushing loss, the years of hiding, and finally, the rediscovery of music on her own terms. When the final notes faded, There was a moment of complete silence before the audience erupted in applause. Li Wei looked up and saw her students in the front row, clapping with uninhibited enthusiasm. Behind them sat Professor Huang, his usual stern expression replaced by something that might have been pride. Li Wei stood and took a single modest bow. As she walked off stage, she felt lighter somehow, as if she had finally set down a burden she had carried for too long. Backstage, Ms. Tao waited with a small bouquet of flowers. "That was beautiful, Li Wei. Not just the playing, but the composition itself." "Thank you," Li Wei said, accepting the flowers. "It felt right. Will you play again?" Ms. Tao asked. Li Wei considered the question. The performance had awakened something in her. Not the old ambition, but a new understanding of what music could be in her life. Not a demand or an obligation, but a gift she could choose to share. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I will. On my own terms." 6 months had passed since Li Wei's performance at the benefit concert. The small recital had unexpectedly changed her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. A video of her playing After Silence had been shared online by a parent, and while it hadn't gone viral in the usual sense, it had reached exactly the right people in the music world. Former colleagues, teachers, and fans who had wondered what happened to the promising young pianist, Li Wei Yan. On this particular morning, Li Wei sat in her small apartment, sipping tea as she reviewed applications for the scholarship program. The fund had grown beyond expectations, allowing her to accept 15 children from underprivileged backgrounds instead of the initial 5. The simple joy this brought her was worth facing her fears and stepping onto that stage. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Tao. "Don't forget, the New York Philharmonic director is visiting today. No pressure, but he specifically asked to observe your teaching methods." Li Wei smiled at the no pressure part. 6 months ago, such a visit would have sent her into a panic. Now she felt only a gentle flutter of anticipation. Her teaching methods were unconventional, focusing on joy and expression before technical perfection, but they were working. Her students played with a freedom that many professionally trained musicians had lost. Her small keyboard still sat in the corner of her bedroom, but it had been joined by a modest upright piano that took up most of her living room wall. She'd saved for months to afford it, refusing Director Thompson's offer to have the Academy provide one. It was important to her that it was hers, bought with money she had earned teaching. Li Wei finished her tea and got ready for the day. As she walked to the Academy, she nodded to neighbors who now greeted her by name. Her life had expanded beyond the shadows. She wasn't hiding anymore, but she also wasn't returning to her old life. She was building something new, something authentic. At the Academy, Jun was waiting outside her classroom, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Teacher Lee, I practiced the new piece all weekend," he announced proudly. "The whole weekend? I hope you played outside too," Li Wei replied, unlocking the door. Jun grinned. "I practiced in the morning and played soccer in the afternoon. Balance, just like you said." "Perfect balance," Li Wei agreed, remembering how her own childhood had contained no such thing. From age 6, the piano had consumed every waking hour. No soccer, no friends. No normal childhood experiences. Their lesson went well, with Jun showing remarkable progress on a piece that would have been considered too advanced for a child his age. But Li Wei had discovered that children often rose to expectations when those expectations were wrapped in encouragement rather than pressure. "Before you go," Li Wei said as their time came to an end, "would you like to try something new?" She placed a sheet of handwritten music on the piano. "I wrote this yesterday. It doesn't have a title yet." Jun's eyes widened. "You wrote this? Like made it up?" Li Wei nodded. "Composers are just people who decided to create music instead of only playing music others created. Can I be a composer too?" Jun asked, studying the sheet with newfound reverence. "Of course. In fact, for next week, I want you to bring me a short piece you've written. It can be very simple, just a few measures." Jun's face lit up with excitement as he carefully placed the sheet music in his folder. After he left, Li Wei had a short break before her next student. She used the time to jot down ideas for a new composition that had been forming in her mind. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Professor Huang standing in the doorway, accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit, the New York Philharmonic director, she presumed. "Li Wei, may we observe your next class?" Professor Huang asked with uncharacteristic politeness. Of course, she replied, gesturing to chairs at the back of the room. Her next lesson was with a group of 3 beginners, all around 8 years old. They entered with a mixture of nervousness and excitement, their eyes darting to the visitors before settling on Li Wei. "Good morning, everyone," Li Wei said warmly. "Today we're going to learn about how music can tell a story. But first, let's warm up our fingers and our imaginations." What followed was a lesson unlike anything the Philharmonic director had observed before. Li Wei had the children close their eyes and imagine walking through a forest while she played, then asked them to describe what they saw. Then she guided them to create simple melodies that matched their visions. A bird singing, leaves rustling, a stream flowing. By the end of the class, each child had created a short musical phrase that genuinely expressed something meaningful to them. They left chattering excitedly about what they would add to their forest songs at home. "Remarkable," the director said after they had gone. "You didn't mention correct finger placement once, yet they were all using proper technique without realizing it." Li Wei smiled. "Children learn best when they don't know they're being taught. The technical skills serve the music, not the other way around. Would you have time to discuss something with us?" he asked, glancing at Professor Huang. They moved to Director Thompson's office, where Ms. Tao was already waiting. Li Wei sat down, curious but not anxious. "We have a proposal for you," the Philharmonic director began. "We're launching a new program called Music for All that aims to bring classical music education to underserved communities. We need someone to design the curriculum and train the teachers." He leaned forward slightly. "Your approach is exactly what we've been looking for." Li Wei blinked in surprise. "You want me to design a curriculum?" "Based on your methods," he confirmed. "The joy-first approach, the creativity, the way you make classical music accessible without diluting its complexity." He smiled. "We've observed several highly regarded teachers, but none have achieved what you have with your students in such a short time." "This would be a consulting position," Ms. Tao added quickly. "You could continue teaching here while developing the program." Li Wei's mind raced with possibilities. A program that could reach thousands of children, giving them access to music education that focused on expression and joy rather than rigid perfection. "There's one more thing," Professor Huang said. "They would like you to perform at the program's launch. A single piece, your choice." Li Wei felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but it was milder now, more like anticipation than fear. "I'll need some time to think about it," she said honestly. "Of course," the director replied, "but I hope you'll consider it seriously. Your story, walking away from fame to find a more meaningful relationship with music, that resonates. It could inspire many young musicians struggling with the pressures of performance." After they left, Li Wei remained in the office, turning the opportunity over in her mind. A year ago, even 6 months ago, she would have refused immediately. But now, that evening, she visited the small community center where her scholarship students who couldn't afford pianos came to practice. She watched as an elderly volunteer patiently guided a young girl's hands on the keys of a donated upright piano that had seen better days. "Miss Li," the girl called out when she noticed her. "I can play my song now. Want to hear?" Li Wei sat beside her as the child played a simple tune with complete concentration. It wasn't perfect, notes were missed, timing was off, but the girl's face showed pure joy. "That was beautiful." "May?" Li Wei said truthfully. "My grandma cried when I played it for her," May said proudly. "She said music is like magic." "Your grandma is right," Li Wei agreed. Later, walking home under a sky full of stars, Li Wei made her decision. She would accept the Philharmonic's offer, not for fame or recognition, but because every child deserved the chance to create magic. The night of the Music for All program launch arrived on a crisp autumn evening. The venue was smaller than the concert halls of Li Wei's past, chosen for its accessibility rather than its prestige. The audience was a mixture of donors, educators, families from the pilot communities, and, seated in the front row, all of Li Wei's students. Backstage, Li Wei adjusted the simple black dress she had chosen to wear. No elaborate gown or painful high heels, just comfortable elegance. On a small table lay the music for the piece she would play, her own composition, expanded from the one she had performed at the benefit concert. She had titled it New Beginnings,